What if I told you that there's a spiritual principle so powerful, so specifically aligned with certain communities' historical experiences, that one sincere prayer could begin to unravel patterns of financial limitation that have persisted for generations? What if the very struggles that have challenged African-American families for centuries have created spiritual conditions that make them uniquely positioned to access divine abundance in ways that might surprise you? Here's what I know. While financial experts teach complex strategies for wealth building, while economists analyze generational poverty through statistical models, while self-help gurus promise prosperity through positive thinking, something extraordinary happens when people who have experienced systematic economic exclusion turn to spiritual principles that connect their historical suffering to divine promises of restoration. But here's the question that should make you pause. Why do communities that have faced the most severe economic challenges often demonstrate the strongest faith in divine provision? Why do people whose ancestors survived slavery, segregation, and systematic economic exclusion maintain spiritual traditions that speak with such certainty about God's ability to transform financial circumstances instantly and completely? Let me ask you something else that might challenge everything you think you know about wealth creation and spiritual breakthrough. When you think about building generational wealth, what approaches come to mind? Real estate investments, educational advancement, business development, careful financial planning over decades? All practical strategies, absolutely. But what if I told you that there's a spiritual dimension to wealth creation that operates according to principles most financial advisors never learned? Principles that certain communities understand because their historical experiences taught them to depend on divine intervention when human systems failed them. Here's what should make you uncomfortable. The most dramatic financial transformations happening in communities of color aren't always following conventional wealth-building strategies. They're emerging from spiritual breakthroughs that seem to unlock resources, opportunities, and favor that can't be explained through standard economic models. Breakthroughs that often begin with single moments of profound spiritual surrender and declaration. Let me be very direct with you. After you explore this perspective, you will never look at prayer and financial breakthrough the same way again. You will never understand generational patterns the same way. You will never think about spiritual authority over economic circumstances the same way. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't motivational speaking or prosperity theology. It's documented in testimonies, verified by community transformations, and grounded in spiritual principles that connect historical suffering to prophetic promises in ways that produce measurable results. The truth is, there's a reason certain prayers seem to carry authority that breaks through financial barriers that have persisted for decades. There's a reason spiritual declarations made by people who understand both suffering and divine faithfulness often produce breakthrough that surprises even them. There's a reason communities that have survived the most systematic economic oppression also carry spiritual wisdom about accessing divine provision that other communities never needed to develop. This is not just another discussion about faith and finances or positive thinking and prosperity. This is an exploration of spiritual principles that operate specifically in the context of historical injustice, generational trauma, and the unique relationship between suffering and divine intervention that certain communities understand because their survival depended on it. So if this exploration makes you question everything you thought you knew about wealth building and spiritual breakthrough, good. Divine truth often challenges conventional financial wisdom. If it pushes you to consider possibilities that economic education didn't prepare you for, even better. That discomfort might be exactly what's needed to recognize spiritual principles that have been producing financial miracles in communities that learn to depend on God when every human system failed them. Are you ready? Because once you understand the spiritual authority that emerges from generational struggle, once you see how historical suffering creates conditions for divine breakthrough, once you recognize the prophetic promises that speak specifically to communities that have been systematically excluded from economic prosperity, you cannot unknow it. And once you realize that these aren't just inspirational concepts, but spiritual realities that continue to produce measurable financial transformation today, you'll understand why one prayer, prayed with understanding of these principles, might accomplish more than decades of conventional wealth-building strategies. Let me take you into the spiritual and historical context that shapes how certain communities approach prayer for financial breakthrough, because understanding the unique relationship between suffering, faith, and divine intervention makes it clear why conventional approaches to wealth building often miss the most powerful spiritual resources available for breaking generational poverty. We're examining communities that develop spiritual practices under conditions where economic survival required divine intervention, where conventional wealth-building strategies were systematically denied, where financial breakthrough often came through means that economic textbooks couldn't explain or predict. Consider the historical reality that shaped these spiritual approaches. For centuries, communities of African descent in America were legally prohibited from accumulating wealth through traditional means. Home ownership was restricted. Business ownership was limited. Educational opportunities were denied. Banking services were withheld. Every conventional path to generational wealth building was systematically blocked by laws, policies, and social structures designed to maintain economic exclusion. But here's what makes this historical context spiritually significant. When human systems of wealth creation are unavailable, when conventional financial strategies are prohibited, when every door to economic advancement is closed by external forces, communities either collapse or develop spiritual resources that enable survival and breakthrough through divine intervention rather than human methodology. The spiritual traditions that emerged from these conditions weren't theoretical theology about prosperity. They were practical faith systems that had to produce actual results: food when there was none, shelter when housing was denied, income when employment was restricted, provision when every conventional source was cut off. These spiritual practices were tested under conditions where ineffective faith meant starvation, homelessness, and community destruction. This context matters because it reveals why certain prayers carry authority that others might not understand. When communities develop spiritual practices under survival conditions, when faith has to work or people suffer, when prayer becomes the primary resource for addressing impossible circumstances, you get approaches to divine intervention that operate with urgency, specificity, and authority that comfort-based spirituality rarely develops. But here's where this historical foundation connects to contemporary financial breakthrough: the spiritual principles that enable communities to survive economic exclusion, that produce provision under impossible circumstances, that broke through barriers that seemed insurmountable. These same principles continue to operate today when applied with understanding of their historical power and prophetic foundation. The difference is that contemporary communities often have access to both spiritual resources and conventional wealth-building strategies. They can combine the divine intervention principles their ancestors developed with practical financial tools that are now legally available. This combination, spiritual breakthrough principles applied alongside practical economic strategies, creates possibilities for generational wealth transformation that neither approach alone could accomplish. So as we explore how one prayer might break generational poverty patterns, as we examine why certain spiritual declarations seem to unlock resources and opportunities that surprise even those who pray them, we're investigating spiritual principles that were developed under the most challenging economic conditions in American history, and have been producing breakthrough for communities that learn to depend on divine intervention when human systems fail them completely. Now, let me show you the first piece of evidence that will fundamentally reshape how you understand the spiritual dynamics that can transform generational financial patterns. We're going to examine the principle of covenant reversal, and I'm going to reveal to you why prayers that acknowledge historical injustice while declaring divine promises of restoration carry authority that can break through economic limitations that have persisted for decades. Here's what you need to understand about the spiritual mechanics that operate when communities that have experienced systematic economic exclusion turn to divine intervention for financial breakthrough. There's a biblical principle that connects historical suffering to prophetic restoration, and when this principle is activated through specific prayer approaches, it can produce financial transformation that seems to defy conventional economic logic. The principle operates like this. When injustice has been committed against a people group, when economic resources have been systematically stolen or denied, when generational wealth has been prevented through oppressive systems, divine justice creates what theologians call covenant debt that must eventually be repaid through supernatural restoration that exceeds what was originally taken or denied. But here's where it gets profound. This isn't just theoretical theology about eventual justice in the afterlife. This is a spiritual principle that can be activated through prayer approaches that specifically acknowledge the historical injustice while declaring faith in God's commitment to restoration, creating spiritual conditions that release divine intervention into contemporary financial circumstances. Let me show you how this principle manifests in documented breakthrough testimonies that challenge conventional understanding of wealth creation and spiritual intervention. When individuals from communities that have experienced generational economic exclusion pray prayers that combine acknowledgement of historical injustice with declaration of biblical promises about restoration, something shifts in the spiritual realm that begins to attract resources, opportunities, and favor that can't be explained through normal economic processes. But here's what makes this spiritual principle so powerful. The prayer approach doesn't require extensive theological education or complex spiritual techniques. It requires understanding three simple elements: acknowledging what was taken, declaring what God promises to restore, and positioning oneself to receive divine intervention that exceeds human limitation. Think about what this means practically. When someone whose family experienced economic exclusion through slavery, segregation, or systematic discrimination prays a prayer that says, "God, you see what was stolen from my family line. You promised to restore what was taken. I position myself to receive breakthrough that exceeds what we lost." They're activating spiritual authority that connects their personal financial situation to divine justice principles that operate beyond human economic systems. Now here's what should shock you about the frequency of breakthrough that follows these prayer approaches. Communities that understand this principle consistently report financial transformations that seem to happen through unexpected sources, unusual opportunities, and providential connections that produce wealth accumulation at speeds that conventional financial planning couldn't predict or replicate. The breakthroughs don't always follow predictable patterns. Sometimes they come through business opportunities that appear suddenly, sometimes through real estate investments that produce exceptional returns, sometimes through inheritance from sources that seemed unlikely, sometimes through career advancement that happens rapidly, sometimes through legal settlements that provide restoration. The common factor isn't the method. It's the spiritual principle that attracts divine intervention into financial circumstances. But let me take you deeper into why this prayer approach carries such authority for communities that have experienced generational economic exclusion. The spiritual principle operates specifically in contexts where injustice has created covenant debt that divine justice must eventually address. When communities that have been systematically excluded from wealth creation turn to God for restoration, they're not just asking for charity. They're claiming spiritual inheritance that is owed to them through divine justice. Here's what biblical scholarship reveals about this principle. Throughout Scripture, when God's people experience economic oppression, when their resources are stolen or denied, when they face generational poverty through systematic injustice, divine intervention consistently produces restoration that exceeds what was originally lost. The pattern is so consistent that theologians identify it as a fundamental principle of divine justice rather than occasional mercy. Now, let me show you something that connects this biblical principle to contemporary financial breakthrough. The same divine justice that operated in biblical times to restore what was taken from oppressed communities continues to operate today when activated through prayer approaches that understand the spiritual dynamics of covenant restoration and generational breakthrough. The authority comes from understanding that generational poverty in communities that experience systematic economic exclusion isn't just unfortunate circumstances. It's the result of injustice that divine justice must eventually address. When prayers are offered from this understanding, they carry spiritual weight that can break through financial limitations that seem insurmountable through conventional approaches. But here's what makes this principle particularly relevant for contemporary breakthrough. Many families that have experienced generational economic limitations don't realize that their financial struggles may be connected to historical injustices that create spiritual grounds for claiming divine restoration rather than just hoping for gradual improvement through conventional wealth-building strategies. So when we examine how one prayer might begin to break generational poverty patterns, when we explore why certain spiritual declarations seem to unlock resources that surprise even those who pray them, we're investigating spiritual principles that connect historical injustice to divine restoration in ways that can produce financial transformation at speeds that economic models don't predict, but biblical patterns consistently demonstrate. But now let me take you into something that will completely revolutionize how you understand the spiritual conditions that enable rapid financial transformation. We're going to examine the principle of generational faith accumulation, and I'm going to show you why prayers offered by descendants of communities that maintain spiritual faith under extreme suffering carry compound spiritual authority that can break through financial barriers that have persisted for generations. Here's what you need to understand about the unique spiritual dynamics that operate in communities where faith was tested under the most challenging circumstances. When people maintain belief in divine provision despite experiencing systematic deprivation, when they continue to trust God's promises while facing economic exclusion, when they pass down faith to children despite evidence suggesting divine abandonment, they create what spiritual scholars call accumulated spiritual capital that builds generational authority for breakthrough. The principle works like this. Every prayer offered by ancestors who maintain faith despite suffering, every declaration of trust in God's provision despite experiencing scarcity, every moment of continued belief despite evidence of abandonment, these acts of faith under pressure create spiritual inheritance that their descendants can access through prayer approaches that acknowledge this accumulated spiritual authority. But here's where it gets profound. This accumulated spiritual capital isn't just theoretical inheritance that provides comfort during difficult times. It's active spiritual authority that can be activated through specific prayer approaches to produce measurable financial breakthrough that seems to exceed what individual faith alone could accomplish. Let me show you what this looks like in documented breakthrough testimonies that illustrate how generational faith creates spiritual conditions for rapid financial transformation. When individuals whose ancestors maintained faith through slavery, segregation, or systematic economic exclusion pray prayers that specifically acknowledge their inherited spiritual authority while declaring faith in divine provision, they often experience financial breakthrough that seems to compound generational faith accumulation into contemporary miraculous intervention. Think about what this means spiritually. If your great-grandmother prayed for provision while picking cotton for minimal wages, but maintained faith in God's promises, if your grandfather declared trust in divine justice despite facing employment discrimination, but continued believing in breakthrough, if your parents worship God despite financial struggles, but raise you with faith in divine provision, their spiritual investments create inherited authority that your prayers can activate for financial transformation. But here's what makes this generational spiritual inheritance so powerful for contemporary breakthrough. The faith accumulated through generations of maintaining belief despite evidence suggesting divine absence creates spiritual conditions that enable rapid restoration when circumstances finally align with divine timing for breakthrough. The accumulated spiritual authority operates like compound interest in the spiritual realm. Each generation that maintains faith despite financial struggle adds to spiritual capital that eventually reaches levels where divine intervention produces breakthrough that exceeds what any individual generation could have accessed alone through their personal faith. Now here's what should shock you about how this generational spiritual authority manifests in contemporary financial breakthrough. When descendant of communities that accumulated generations of faith under suffering prayers that acknowledge their inherited spiritual capital while declaring expectation for restoration, they often experience provision that seems to come from sources they never cultivated, opportunities they never pursued, and favor that exceeds what their individual qualifications would typically attract. The breakthrough often comes through what can only be described as supernatural acceleration. Business opportunities that should take years to develop happen in months. Real estate investments that typically require extensive capital become available through unusual financing. Career advancement that normally follows gradual progression happens rapidly. Financial settlements that seemed unlikely become favorable. Educational opportunities that seemed unaffordable become accessible. But let me take you deeper into why this generational faith accumulation creates such powerful spiritual conditions for financial transformation. When communities maintain faith in divine provision despite experiencing systematic economic exclusion, they develop spiritual authority in a specific area where they experience the most suffering, financial provision, and economic breakthrough. Here's what biblical scholarship reveals about this spiritual principle. Throughout Scripture, communities that maintain faith despite economic oppression consistently experience divine intervention that produces financial restoration at levels that exceed what they could have accumulated through conventional means during the same time periods. The pattern suggests that divine justice operates specifically to address areas where faithful communities have experienced the greatest testing. If generational faith was tested primarily through financial deprivation, divine restoration often manifests primarily through financial breakthrough that compensates for generations of accumulated loss through systematic exclusion. Now, let me show you something that connects this principle to contemporary prayer approaches that can activate generational spiritual authority. When individuals understand that their ancestors' faithful prayers during financial hardship created spiritual inheritance that they can access, they can pray from a position of accumulated authority rather than individual desperation. Instead of praying, "God, please help me with my financial struggles," from a position of scarcity and limitation, they can pray, "God, I thank you for the faith my ancestors maintained despite financial oppression. I claim the spiritual authority they accumulated through generations of trusting you despite evidence suggesting abandonment. I declare breakthrough that honors their faithful prayers and produces restoration that exceeds what was taken from our family line." This prayer approach activates generational spiritual capital while positioning the individual to receive breakthrough that builds on accumulated faith rather than starting from personal desperation. The spiritual dynamics operate differently because the prayer acknowledges inherited authority rather than requesting charity. But here's what makes this understanding particularly transformative for breaking generational poverty. Many individuals don't realize that their family's financial struggles may be balanced by inherited spiritual authority that their ancestors accumulated through maintaining faith under impossible circumstances. Authority that can be activated through prayer approaches that understand generational spiritual dynamics. So when we examine how one prayer might break patterns of generational financial limitation, when we explore why certain spiritual declarations produce breakthrough that surprises even those who offer them, we're investigating spiritual principles that connect generational faith accumulation to contemporary divine intervention in ways that can transform financial circumstances at speeds that honor accumulated spiritual authority rather than limiting breakthrough to gradual conventional wealth. Building processes. The pattern suggests that divine intervention creates opportunities and favor, but individuals must be practically prepared to receive and develop those opportunities into sustained financial breakthrough. The spiritual and practical elements work together to produce transformation that neither approach alone could accomplish within similar time frames. Now, let me show you something that connects this principle to prayer approaches that can activate both spiritual breakthrough and practical positioning for receiving that breakthrough. When individuals understand that prayers for financial transformation create spiritual conditions that make opportunities available, they can combine prophetic declarations with strategic actions that position them to recognize and receive those opportunities. Instead of praying for breakthrough and then waiting passively for money to appear, they can declare financial restoration and immediately begin practical actions that position them for the opportunities that spiritual intervention makes available. Researching business models, developing professional relationships, investigating investment options, acquiring skills that increase earning potential. But here's what makes this understanding particularly transformative for breaking generational poverty. Many individuals pray for financial breakthrough, but don't take the practical actions necessary to receive and develop the opportunities that their prayers create. While others take practical business actions but don't access the spiritual resources that can accelerate their conventional efforts through divine favor and providential timing. The most effective approach combines both elements. Prophetic prayers that create spiritual conditions for breakthrough with practical actions that position individuals to recognize, receive, and develop the opportunities that spiritual intervention makes available. This faith-action partnership produces financial transformation that demonstrates both divine intervention and human responsibility working together. So when we examine how one prayer might begin to break generational poverty patterns through faith-activated opportunity, when we explore why certain individuals experience breakthrough that combines spiritual intervention with practical success, we're investigating principles that connect prophetic declaration with strategic positioning in ways that enable both divine favor and human capability to produce financial transformation at speeds that honor both spiritual breakthrough and practical wisdom. Now, let me speak directly to your heart about what all of the spiritual evidence actually means for your personal understanding of financial breakthrough, for recognizing prophetic authority that may flow through your own family line, and for comprehending why this moment in your life might be the exact time when generational patterns are meant to shift through divine intervention that honors your ancestors' faithfulness. Here's what I need you to understand about why this revelation has found you at this precise moment in your spiritual and financial journey. You are not accidentally discovering these prayer principles. You are not randomly encountering evidence about generational spiritual authority and covenant restoration. You are living in the exact season when divine timing is aligning with your family's spiritual inheritance to create conditions for a breakthrough that could transform not just your financial circumstances, but the entire trajectory of your family line for generations to come. But think about what you've just learned through examining these spiritual principles. The covenant reversal that connects historical injustice to divine restoration promises. The generational faith accumulation that your ancestors built through maintaining belief despite financial oppression. The prophetic declaration authority that can align your circumstances with biblical promises. The faith-activated opportunities that combine spiritual breakthrough with practical positioning for receiving divine intervention. This isn't just inspirational information about prayer and prosperity. This is documentation of spiritual inheritance that may already be operating in your family line, authority that your ancestors accumulated through faithfulness under impossible circumstances, covenant debts that divine justice must eventually address through restoration, prophetic promises that specifically apply to communities that experience systematic economic exclusion. And if you're someone whose family has experienced generational financial struggle, if your ancestors faced economic oppression through slavery, segregation, or systematic discrimination, if your parent and grandparents maintained faith despite evidence suggesting divine abandonment, then understanding these principles changes everything about recognizing the spiritual resources that may be available to you right now through prayer approaches that activate inherited authority rather than requesting charity. Let me tell you what this means for your personal financial transformation. The economic limitations that your family has experienced for decades may not be permanent circumstances that require gradual improvement through conventional wealth-building strategies. They may be temporary barriers that can be broken through spiritual intervention that operates according to divine justice principles designed to restore what injustice has prevented. But here's where this gets deeply personal and profoundly empowering. The financial struggles that challenge your family for generations may have created the exact spiritual conditions that enable rapid breakthrough when divine timing aligns with prophetic promises about restoration. Your ancestors' faithfulness during economic hardship may have accumulated spiritual authority that your prayers can activate for financial transformation that exceeds what conventional approaches could accomplish. This means that the prayer you offer today about financial breakthrough may carry compound authority from generations of faithful ancestors who maintain belief despite experiencing scarcity, who trust the divine promises despite evidence suggesting abandonment, who passed down faith despite circumstances that would justify despair. Their spiritual investments may have created inherited authority that your declaration can release for contemporary miraculous intervention. Now let me speak to everyone discovering these principles, regardless of your specific family background, because these spiritual insights reveal truths about divine justice and breakthrough that affect our understanding of prayer, faith, and financial transformation in ways that could revolutionize how communities approach both spiritual and practical solutions to economic challenges. If you wonder why some people seem to experience financial breakthrough that exceeds their qualifications, education, or conventional efforts, understanding these spiritual principles provides insight into divine intervention that operates beyond human economic systems. If you felt frustrated by gradual approaches to wealth building that seem inadequate for addressing urgent financial needs, these prayer approaches offer access to spiritual resources that can accelerate transformation through divine favor and providential timing. The spiritual principles we've explored suggest that divine justice operates specifically to address economic injustice through restoration that exceeds what conventional financial strategies could produce within similar time frames. Communities that have experienced systematic economic exclusion may have access to spiritual resources for breakthrough that other populations never needed to develop because their circumstances never required dependence on divine intervention for survival. But here's what makes this moment in history so spiritually significant for financial breakthrough. We're living in a time when understanding of these spiritual principles is being restored to communities that may have lost access to this inherited wisdom. When prophetic promises about restoration are reaching people who have the spiritual authority to activate them. When divine timing is creating conditions for breakthrough that can demonstrate God's justice through personal financial transformation. This means that the financial breakthrough you've been praying for, the generational patterns you've been hoping to change, the abundance you've been believing for, these may be closer to manifestation than you realize because your prayers are operated within spiritual principles that connect your personal circumstances to divine justice commitments that operate beyond human economic limitations. Let me be very direct about what this understanding requires from you personally. You cannot treat the spiritual inheritance as interesting information that you appreciate but don't activate. You cannot acknowledge these prayer principles without applying them to your specific financial circumstances. You cannot recognize the spiritual authority that may flow through your family line without positioning yourself to receive the breakthrough that authority can produce. Once you understand that your ancestors' faithfulness may have accumulated spiritual capital that your prayers can access, once you recognize that historical injustice may have created covenant debts that divine restoration must address. Once you see that prophetic promises about breakthrough may specifically apply to your family's circumstances, you have responsibility to activate these spiritual resources through prayer approaches that align your financial situation with divine justice. Principles. And if you're someone whose family has maintained faith despite financial struggle, whose ancestors trusted God's promises despite experiencing economic oppression, whose spiritual heritage includes generations of belief despite evidence suggesting divine abandonment, then understanding these principles should fundamentally change how you approach prayer for financial breakthrough and how you position yourself to receive divine intervention that honors accumulated spiritual authority. The same divine justice that operates throughout Scripture to restore what injustice has taken continues to work today through prayer approaches that understand covenant restoration and generational spiritual inheritance. The same prophetic promises that enable communities to maintain faith despite economic oppression can be activated through declarations that connect contemporary financial circumstances to biblical commitments about divine restoration. This is your moment to recognize spiritual resources that may have been available all along but weren't accessed because you didn't understand the prayer principles that activate inherited authority. This is your opportunity to position yourself for financial breakthrough that demonstrates divine justice while meeting your practical economic needs. This is your chance to break generational patterns through prayer approaches that combine spiritual authority with faith-based actions that position you to receive providential opportunities. The question isn't whether these spiritual principles operate. The biblical patterns and contemporary testimonies demonstrate they do. The question isn't whether divine justice addresses economic injustice. Scripture and history prove it does. The question is whether you'll have the faith to pray the prayer that activates these principles in your circumstances and the wisdom to take the practical actions that position you to receive the breakthrough that spiritual intervention makes available. Because the truth is this: the one prayer that can break generational poverty isn't a magic formula that eliminates all financial challenges without human participation. It's a prophetic declaration that activates spiritual authority while positioning divine intervention to work through both supernatural favor and practical opportunities in ways that can transform your family's financial future through breakthrough that honors both your ancestors' faithfulness and God's commitment to justice and restoration. Now, here's exactly what I need you to do with these spiritual principles that have been revealed to you, because understanding these prayer approaches is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you take decisive action to apply these covenant restoration principles to your specific financial circumstances, while positioning yourself to receive the breakthrough that spiritual intervention can provide. First, I need you to share this exploration immediately and intentionally with people who need to understand that financial breakthrough may be closer than they realize through prayer approaches that activate spiritual authority rather than requesting charity. And I don't mean casually mentioning prayer and prosperity in conversation. I mean actively, strategically, urgently sharing this evidence with individuals whose families have experienced generational financial struggle but may not realize they carry inherited spiritual authority that can be activated for contemporary breakthrough. Share it with family members who have accepted financial limitation as permanent circumstances that require gradual improvement through conventional wealth-building strategies alone. Share it with friends who have been praying general requests for financial help without understanding the prophetic declaration approaches that could align their circumstances with divine restoration promises. Share it with anyone whose ancestors maintained faith despite economic oppression, but who may not understand how that accumulated spiritual authority can be activated for contemporary financial transformation. Comment below right now. Type BRHRUGH if you're committed to activating these prayer principles in your own financial circumstances. Type authority if you recognize that your family line may carry inherited spiritual capital that can be accessed through prophetic declarations. Type restoration if you understand that divine justice operates to address historical economic injustice through contemporary supernatural intervention. But here's what you need to understand about sharing these spiritual principles. You're not just spreading motivational information about prayer and prosperity. You're participating in the restoration of spiritual inheritance that may have been available to communities for generations, but wasn't accessed because understanding of these prayer approaches was lost or suppressed by systems that benefited from keeping communities dependent on conventional economic strategies that limit breakthrough to gradual improvement. Now it's your responsibility to ensure that spiritual wisdom about covenant restoration and generational authority reaches people who have the inherited spiritual capital to activate these principles, but may not understand how to access this inheritance through prayer approaches that align personal circumstances with divine justice commitments. Subscribe to this channel immediately and activate notifications, because we're going to explore even deeper spiritual principles about financial breakthrough and generational transformation. I'm going to teach you the specific prayer declarations that combine personal identity with biblical restoration promises. We're going to examine the practical actions that position individuals to receive providential opportunities that spiritual intervention creates. We're going to investigate the testimonies that demonstrate how these principles operate in contemporary circumstances to produce measurable financial breakthrough. This is not prosperity theology that promises wealth without spiritual understanding or practical wisdom. This is covenant restoration principles that connect historical injustice to divine restoration through prayer approaches that activate inherited spiritual authority while positioning individuals to receive breakthrough through both supernatural favor and providential opportunities. Every person who subscribes, shares, and engages with this content is supporting the restoration of spiritual wisdom that could transform financial circumstances for entire communities that have access to inherited authority, but may not understand how to activate the spiritual inheritance through prayer approaches that honor both divine justice and practical responsibility. Here's your specific assignment for applying these principles to your personal financial situation. Begin praying prophetic declarations that combine acknowledgement of your family's economic history with declaration of divine restoration promises, while taking immediate practical actions that position you to receive the opportunities that spiritual intervention creates. Instead of general prayers about financial struggles, pray specific declarations like, "Father, I acknowledge the economic challenges my family has faced through systematic exclusion. I declare your promise to restore double for former shame. I position myself to receive supernatural breakthrough that demonstrates your justice through my circumstances." Then immediately take practical actions that demonstrate faith in that declaration. Research business opportunities, develop professional relationships, investigate investment options, acquire skills that increase earning potential. But don't limit this to personal application. Use these principles in conversations about financial breakthrough and generational transformation. When someone assumes that wealth building requires decades of gradual improvement through conventional strategies, share what you've learned about spiritual principles that can accelerate breakthrough through divine intervention. When someone suggests that financial struggles are permanent circumstances that must be accepted, present evidence of covenant restoration principles that can transform generational patterns through prayer approaches that activate inherited spiritual authority. Challenge your faith community and spiritual leaders directly. Ask why these restoration principles aren't taught as part of standard financial ministry or spiritual guidance about economic breakthrough. Question why communities that have experienced historical economic injustice aren't informed about the spiritual inheritance they may carry for financial transformation. Demand that prayer approaches include prophetic declaration methods that align personal circumstances with biblical restoration promises rather than limiting financial prayer to general requests for help. If you're in positions where you can influence spiritual education, community development, or financial literacy programs, then you have even greater responsibility. Include these covenant restoration principles in curricula that address generational poverty and financial transformation. Support programs that combine spiritual breakthrough approaches with practical financial education that acknowledges both divine intervention and human responsibility. Design initiatives that help communities understand their spiritual inheritance while developing practical skills for receiving and managing financial breakthrough. Support ministries and organizations whose work continues to apply these spiritual principles to contemporary economic challenges. Attend conferences where these breakthrough approaches are taught without limitation by conventional prosperity theology or secular financial planning that ignores spiritual resources. Purchase books and resources that explore covenant restoration and generational spiritual authority. Follow and amplify content from spiritual leaders who understand how to combine prophetic declaration with practical positioning for receiving divine intervention. But here's what you absolutely cannot do. You cannot celebrate these spiritual principles as interesting information without applying them to your specific financial circumstances. You cannot acknowledge inherited spiritual authority without positioning yourself to receive the breakthrough that authority can produce. You cannot recognize divine restoration promises without praying prophetic declarations that align your circumstances with those promises, while taking practical actions that demonstrate faith in supernatural intervention. This understanding creates spiritual obligation. Recognizing covenant restoration principles makes you responsible for activating these approaches rather than continuing to pray general requests that don't access available spiritual resources. Understanding generational spiritual authority means positioning yourself to receive breakthrough that honors accumulated faith while demonstrating divine justice through contemporary financial transformation. Here's your assignment for the next 30 days. Share these principles with at least 3 family members who need to understand their spiritual inheritance for financial breakthrough. Have at least 2 substantive conversations about how prayer approaches can align personal circumstances with divine restoration promises. Begin praying prophetic declarations that combine your family's economic history with biblical commitments to restoration, while taking immediate practical actions that position you for providential opportunities. And honestly evaluate whether your current financial strategies include spiritual resources that can accelerate breakthrough through divine intervention that operates beyond conventional economic processes. Because the truth is this: the spiritual principles that connect historical injustice to divine restoration through contemporary breakthrough weren't preserved through generations of faithful communities, so they could remain theoretical knowledge about God's justice. They were maintained so that contemporary individuals would have access to covenant authority that can transform financial circumstances through prayer approaches that activate inherited spiritual capital while positioning divine intervention to work through both supernatural favor and practical opportunities in ways that demonstrate God's commitment to restoration and justice. Let me leave you with this final truth that should fundamentally reshape how you understand spiritual inheritance and the relationship between prayer, faith, and financial breakthrough that operates according to divine justice principles rather than conventional economic limitations. The covenant restoration principles that connect historical injustice to contemporary divine intervention represent spiritual inheritance that operates at levels of authority that challenge conventional understanding of prayer and financial transformation. The accumulated spiritual capital from generations of faithful ancestors, the prophetic promises about restoration for oppressed communities, the divine justice commitments that address economic exclusion. These spiritual resources continue to provide access to breakthrough that exceeds what conventional wealth-building strategies predict as possible within normal time frames. This spiritual inheritance wasn't discovered to create unrealistic expectations about instant wealth without practical responsibility. It emerged from understanding biblical principles that connect suffering to restoration, injustice to divine intervention, accumulated faith to contemporary breakthrough in ways that operate beyond human economic systems, while requiring both spiritual declaration and practical positioning to receive what divine justice makes available. You are encountering these prayer principles at precisely the moment in your spiritual journey when divine timing may be aligning with your family's spiritual inheritance to create conditions for breakthrough that could transform not just your financial circumstances, but the entire trajectory of your family line for generations to come. The spiritual authority that your ancestors accumulated through maintaining faith despite economic oppression continues to provide access to restoration that honors their faithfulness while meeting your contemporary financial needs. The communities that preserve these spiritual principles through centuries of economic exclusion, who maintain faith despite systematic deprivation, who trust the divine promises despite evidence suggesting abandonment, who pass down covenant understanding despite circumstances that would justify despair. They maintained the spiritual wisdom so that contemporary generations would have access to breakthrough approaches that activate inherited authority rather than limiting prayer to general requests for charity. Their spiritual investment continues to provide covenant restoration opportunities for individuals whose DNA carries this accumulated faith, whose family lines include this spiritual capital, whose circumstances align with biblical restoration promises that operate specifically to address economic injustice through contemporary divine intervention. This is your moment to activate spiritual resources that may have been available all along but weren't accessed because you didn't understand the prayer approaches that align personal financial circumstances with divine justice commitments. This is your opportunity to position yourself for breakthrough that demonstrates both supernatural intervention and practical wisdom working together to produce financial transformation that honors inherited spiritual authority while meeting immediate economic needs. The prayer principles exist. The spiritual inheritance operates. The divine restoration promises continue to provide access to breakthrough that exceeds conventional economic limitations. What you do with this understanding will determine whether accumulated spiritual authority produces financial transformation in your circumstances or whether covenant restoration resources remain unactivated because they weren't accessed through prayer approaches that combine prophetic declaration with faith-based positioning for receiving divine intervention. Choose faith over limitation. Pray declaration over desperation. Activate authority over accepting circumstances. The one prayer that breaks generational poverty is a prophetic declaration that aligns your financial circumstances with divine restoration promises while positioning you to receive breakthrough that honors both your ancestors' spiritual investments and God's commitment to justice through contemporary supernatural intervention that transforms economic limitations into abundance that demonstrates divine faithfulness across generations.